Hello, everybody, and welcome to the very first episode of our hit new podcast, Therapy Toolkit, the podcast for you. In probably 30 minutes, as this is our pilot, if you listen to this, we will give you emotional tools that you can use to apply to your day today and the lives of people around you. My name is Ryan Wilson, and I'm a second-year college student majoring in software engineering. In my mental wellness journey, I've learned a lot about cognitive behavioral therapy. I want to give those tools that I've had to learn myself to others because no one should have to do that. There is support.
And I'm Melissa Recor. I am a trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapist. I have worked in mental health placements for over 10 plus years. And our goal is to bring mental health education to as many people as possible. So with that, let's start with episode 1.
What's the topic today, Melissa?
Today, we are going to talk about cognitive distortions. And cognitive distortions is really unhelpful or untrue thinking patterns that people fall into at different times in their lives during stressful events, whether that's environmental or internal. I want to make sure when we talk about cognitive distortions that we understand this is a relatively new psychological theory that has come out from Aaron Beck in the 1960s. This is about thinking about the traps that people are falling into, and it's changing the way people are seeing situations and then causing them longer term distress. There are some core cognitive distortions that we are going to talk about today, so that way people can walk away understanding what these unhelpful thinking styles are and how to recognize when they're happening, and things to do to challenge them. So, with that, let's jump into our cognitive distortions. Today, we are going to talk about multiple. I'm going to list them all out and then we're going to break them down one by one. So, there's mental filtering, jumping to conclusions, personalization, catastrophizing, black and white thinking, shoulding and musting, overgeneralizing, labeling, emotional reasoning, and magnification and minimization.
Wonderful.
Wonderful, right? So let's start with mental filtering. When we talk about mental filtering, we are talking about the brain seeing an emergency happening and the brain seeing us as being in a threat. And the purpose of our brain putting us in mental filtering is to focus specifically on that threat so that way we can preserve our lives. The problem is nowadays we are not in life or death situations as much as we were when this was evolved and developed in our brains. So, a lot of times, this ends up being something I describe as the zombie and the butterfly.
What are the zombie and butterfly?
So, Ryan, imagine that you have a zombie running at you, and this zombie has obviously intentions of eating your brain.
They're all in my brain.
All of your brain. And if you do not focus on that zombie and think about what you are going to do to get yourself into a safe place or fight the zombie, you have to decide what you're going to do, but you need to focus on that zombie running at you.
Oh, I see. Threat neutralization. So you're completely focused on the threat in front of you and nothing else.
Exactly.
Because, of course, like, in primal times, we need to focus purely on the threat in front of us, this tiger, this saber-toothed tiger, right? And
Hmm.
that is that's going to kill us. Nothing else matters in the moment besides the zombie that's about to eat my goddamn brains. What
Exactly.
about the butterfly?
So, the butterfly is what's in the field to the right of you in your peripheral visions, right? If you stop focusing on how to escape from that zombie and start looking at that beautiful monarch to your right, you are probably going to get your brains eaten, right?
This is an amazing example.
That's how it works, right? So, mental filtering is actually designed to have you hyper focused or tunnel visioned on what the threat is so that way you can think about how you are going to survive it, right? Not helpful in today's world because there's not really zombies going after you. There's not saber-toothed tigers behind your couch anymore, right? So now when you're engaging in mental filtering, what's happening is you're actually missing out on a lot of stuff. So you're having one intense experience, but you're not seeing the whole situation.
Right now, we have to deal with tasks like just a bunch of homework and a lot of complex social issues and all these things. Our brains are not designed for today. So whenever I'm talking to my friends, they always feel very bad they're not able to complete all their things. I mean, I feel like it's always important to recognize like it's amazing that you're doing any of it. I'm looking in the mirror and I'm like, wow, I had like 10 tasks to do today. I did like 3, but I did them. And it's so hard to do any of them. You have to have this massively organized Google Calendar and your Trello workspace and all these different tools just to help you. There's so many meetings and classes and ridiculous amount of things you got to deal with every day. And it's amazing that you do any of it. That's always very important to remember.
And I'm with you on that, Ryan, because guess what? When you have all of these things on your plate and you're just trying to get through a day as an American, right? What does your body do as a response to help you? It gives you tunnel vision, makes it a lot harder.
Yeah. It's very important for our audience. If you realize what mental filtering is and all these other cognitive distortions are, then you can notice when they're happening. And once you become conscious of your actions and why you're doing them, then you can take steps to prevent them. Because we do not have to be controlled by our feelings nor our beliefs. We can act rationally to according to our logic, what we know is true, rather than what we believe to be true based on patterns from past trauma and just our DNA.
100%, yes. So, a number one question to ask yourself to identify if you've fallen into this thinking trap or this distortion is, I'm very upset, but do I see the whole situation right now, or am I just focusing on a part of it? That's the number one question that is really helpful in identifying if you've fallen into this thinking trap.
Should we go on to the next one or stay on this one?
I'm ready to jumping to conclusions.
Oh, brother.
It's
All
going to
right.
be like that the whole time.
Consider here.
Yep. Jumping to conclusions. I want us to think about this as negative fortune telling. We all know what fortune tellers are. Fortune tellers are telling us about the future. Jumping to conclusions is about deciding what's going to happen in the future based off of possibly past experiences or just worry that you have or anticipatory worry that you have, right? So, jumping to conclusions is about deciding something bad is going to happen in the future when you don't actually know for sure it's going to happen because you're not in the future yet.
Yeah, I mean, we all obviously do this. It's a learned survival strategy, but it's oftentimes safer to not do anything differently from your pattern recognition from past trauma. For example, like me, and I have friends who, we struggle with social cues and getting social cues, or just social awkwardness in general. So then you end up, when you're younger, accidentally making people uncomfortable or a lot of social situations awkward. And then the issue is now you believe, well, I will always make people feel awkward. And the question is, how do you deal with that? A lot of people I know the way they deal with it is by being quiet. Because if you're quiet and you don't talk, you're not going to make people uncomfortable, and nobody will know that you're awkward or don't get social cues or whatever. Of course, then this means that you are controlled purely by your fear and pattern recognition, when in reality you could change and you could get better at that. For me, what I did was I just chose to study people and understand how people work, so then I could allow myself to talk, and I was also okay with making mistakes. Because a lot of times, like especially people who are perfectionists and things, they're afraid they're afraid of saying something wrong or doing something wrong. They're afraid of failing, right? So I ask people like, what are you afraid of? And they don't usually actually say why. They say like, I'm afraid to say this because I could be wrong, or I'm afraid of failing. But of course, that's not actually why they're afraid. They're afraid of the consequence that comes after that. But people don't usually think about that. And then I say, what will happen if you are wrong, or what will happen if you do fail? Because it's important to get to actually what you are truly afraid of. Just in the same vein of if you ask somebody like, how do you
Mm-hmm.
feel? They usually say, well, I think about this or I want this, but that's not actually how you feel. People don't know how to label their emotions. We aren't taught that.
Right, right. And it's actually, we're conditioned as children not even to understand that because we are taught when someone says, how you're feeling today, that you say, like, oh, I'm good, how are you? Right? So, like, we are conditioned to not actually stop and be mindful and present in those situations. Going to jumping to conclusions, I agree with you. What's happening is we're taking one conclusion and we're applying it to all future similar situations. And the reason people do that is because it's very safe. You have more of an idea of what to expect because the future, the unknown, can be very intimidating and scary for people when they don't feel comfortable
Yeah,
in the world around them.
I feel that the only way that I've been able to overcome it is allowing myself to sit in the failure state or the whatever state that I'm afraid of. Because realistically, we are often very afraid of things, right?
Hmm.
Like, oh, I'm afraid of being wrong. I'm afraid of making people feel awkward. I'm afraid of failing this interaction, right? But then if you sit in that failure and allow yourself to let that happen, you realize, oh, I'm still alive. Everything's fine. Then you have to prove to yourself.
100%. A lot of what we're going to be talking about isn't just how to tolerate these situations and how to improve these situations, but how to cognitively accept these situations because this is a part of being human. This is a normalized experience that we all have as humans, right? And it's how we accept and how we treat ourselves through that that really creates our ability to manage things or to avoid, suppress, distract, right? All of these things that we do because we can't handle the emotional pain of sitting with something, when in fact, sitting with it and then moving forward is the healthy answer. And allowing yourself to feel that pain is healthy. When you spend all of your time avoiding and suppressing that pain, the intensity builds up and then people feel as though it's unbearable to handle. Whereas if we deal with the pain of each situation as it comes, it's in a smaller amount, smaller intensity, because it's related to the actual experience. It's not a built up pile of all of the times you felt that way. So jumping to conclusions very much increases that anxiety paradox of anticipating badness coming and spending your time thinking about all those things that could go wrong. That's not helpful for our minds to think about. That leads to things like negativity bias, where you're looking for the bad in things, right? Like mental filtering, the tunnel vision. So jumping to conclusion can actually be kind of like a gateway to other cognitive distortions.
Yeah. I and also like if you always avoid something that you're afraid of, then you will get happy chemicals. You'll get rewarded in your brain for avoiding it because then you avoided the fear. But then when you keep doing that, it makes the fear seem larger and larger. Then it eventually seems like it's impossible to ever overcome it.
So, yeah, what we're talking about is we're talking about short and long-term reinforcers, right? When you avoid something because you don't want to go to it, when you're jumping to conclusions saying that party is going to be bad, so why should I go? And you decide in that moment, I'm not going to that. You have this surge of happy hormone, as you say, right? Where your body is like, phew, I'm not going to have to deal with that. And in that moment, that is very rewarding for the person who was worrying about it. The problem is your brain takes that information, stores that information, and says, okay, the next time Melissa or Ryanne is invited to a party, make sure that we remind them that it's going to be really stressful and too intense and they should just avoid it. And then if you do it again, it intensifies for the next time and it intensifies for the next time. So it's like that snowball effect going down the
Yeah.
hill, right? And that's what happens when
Yeah.
we avoid
Bad things.
bad things.
To quote my friend, that's no good.
No good. Should we move to personalization?
Yes, that's a good idea.
Okay. Personalization is when you are taking 100% of the blame for a situation that may be 0% your fault or partially your fault, but you are doing 100% self-blame on it, right? So you're removing the responsibility and blame of others' behaviors and others' self responsibilities, right? Or personal responsibilities, I should say. And instead, you are absorbing all of those things. So this is like, my friend didn't text me back. And instead of thinking, well, maybe they're busy, maybe they're at lunch, maybe they're studying, you're personalizing it and you're saying, they're not texting me back because they hate me because I'm a horrible person. Right? So
Right.
there's an example of how that works. A lot of times these end up being people pleasers.
Yeah. I people play I mean it's very dangerous, but we feel that it's a safe mentality, right? I mean, it's so scary to think of obviously like all these things we do they're for our own safety, but they so like hinder us. But yeah, the people pleaser mentality, it's this very safe idea of I can put the responsibility on myself because I don't have a lot of people act like they don't have emotional needs. But it's safer to not have emotional needs because then if you put all this burden and responsibility on yourself, other people will not get upset at you. You can please everyone else, make sure no one is upset at you. And then a lot of times when we personalize, it's because we hate being in conflict. If we take on all the stress, then nobody can be upset at us and we can make sure nobody around us is upset, which oftentimes come from past traumas, just dangerous or abusive environments or whatever, because it is safer for you to ensure that nobody is upset. But then, of course, it means you oftentimes become resentful and then you get stressed very easily and you don't know what to do with it because you just believe, well, this is just how things are.
Personalization also leads to a lot of symptoms associated with depression because it impacts the way that we see ourselves in the world, right? So if I am taking on 100% of the blame for the situation, then I'm also giving myself negative feedback, right? Like
Yeah.
if you had tried harder, then they wouldn't have gotten upset with you. If you were a better friend, then they would have texted you back, right? So it comes with a lot of negative self-talk, and it leads a lot of people to having self-esteem issues.
Right. And personalization, it can also end up hurting your relationships around you. Because I mean, first of all, you're not knowing how to accurately handle the conflict, and it's also harder for you to make people feel heard. Because first of all, you just want to make sure nobody's upset. You want to make sure you are suffering. You are suffering, so nobody else is suffering, right? But then it means it's you struggle often to stand up for yourself and self advocate, which also means it's going to be harder to self advocate for people you love around you. So it's very important to take notice of that and allow yourself to feel, well, maybe it's okay if I don't take all the blame. And this idea that it's allowed, other people are allowed to feel upset, and that's okay. Conflict is okay to happen. If we always shy away from conflict, then we are never going to get anything done.
I think that's the golden thread in this, Ryan. I 100% agree with you. I think that for a lot of people, they are thinking about investing in others and not in investing in themselves, and it leads to a lot of these issues that you're describing.
Yeah. I well, I guess on to catastrophizing. We have a lot to do.
Yeah,
I
catastrophizing is fun. Um, and I mean it not that way. But catastrophizing is when there's an old saying when you make a mountain out of a molehill, right?
yeah.
So this is when you have a small situation and in your mind you create a much larger situation and you have a much larger emotional response to that, right? So another example to that friend not texting me back, right? I could catastrophize that situation and I could decide that it was because of all of these past issues in the past and build myself up and build myself up. And now, before she even has a chance to text me back, I'm texting her about all the things in the past that she did that made her a bad friend and I don't need her anyway and all of these things, right? So I created this major chaos and this conflict because I couldn't actually deal with the level of distress even though it was at a lower level, right? And this happens because of something that we call distress intolerance. So distress intolerance is you're feeling a negative emotion, but you actually have no ability to self-regulate that emotion. So your brain automatically starts thinking about all the other times you had that emotion and how you felt about it. And then boom, suddenly you're flooded because you are a collection of that past emotions. Again, because you never processed them, because your brain is trying to help you understand. It's using the doing brain, which we'll talk more about later. But catastrophizing is really about feeling that you have this unbearable response to low distress and your body responds to low distress in a high intensity. And it does it by pulling a lot from the past that also caused distress. Really unhealthy to engage in all facets of life, right? If you are doing this with partners or family members, or you're doing this with really any kind of relationship, you are going to damage that because those people are going to become very fatigued with your emotional intensity, right?
Yeah.
Because you're always bringing 110%, even though the problem required you to bring 10%.
I mean, would you say this relates to mental filtering? Because this idea of like, there is this threat in front of me, and now I need to put all my resource into this to neutralize it.
100%. So these cognitive distortions can couple each other or trigger each other all the time, right? Maybe I'm catastrophizing because I personalized the situation and now I'm mental filtering and I'm not able to get out of it, right? So they are not parallel. They 100% can intersect. And unfortunately, the more cognitive distortions that you include in your thinking styles, the more likely you are to have difficulty managing distress in your life.
Makes total sense.
Yep. So the example of this is, Jill scored low on the test and cries that she's going to fail the class, right? This is no, let's focus on the moment, Jill, and let's not focus on that big picture. But because they feel that way in the moment, they assume that it's true and it's accurate in what it means for their future. When in fact, it's not really. It just feels that way in that moment.
Right. I mean, don't know if this is also a big thing with perfectionism, right? Because you are always afraid that if one bad thing happens, a ton of bad things are going to happen. And so because of that, we have to be afraid at every moment with every small thing, which is exhausting.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is why they have such small amount of tolerance, right? Because
Yeah.
they are constantly looking at that. And you're right. When we talk about perfectionism, a lot of these can end up exasperating those behaviors and thought processes.
No good.
Yeah. The next one, black and white thinking, right? So when we're talking about black and white thinking, we're thinking about all or nothing. We're talking about absolutes. You are a good person or you are a bad person. You are smart or you are dumb. You are beautiful or you're the ugliest person in the world, right? This is black and white thinking. It is very comforting to use black and white thinking for people because then there's no gray area. There's no looking at the collage. There's no understanding that people are both good and bad. Instead, you can just put a label on it, say, this is what's happening, it is bad, and I am responding in this way. It's a very cold, sterile way of looking at situations. It's a very flat way of looking at situations, but in a world that feels overwhelming, it can feel very comforting to be able to look, identify, and move on.
Yeah. I mean, I know I've definitely done black and white thinking before. It's so much easier to just reduce things to pure labels.
Right.
Would you say that this and labeling seem very intertwined?
Yes, definitely. They are definitely very intertwined. A lot of times, labels reinforce black and white thinking. And black and
I
white
think
thinking encourages labels to use.
we should connect this to labeling and talk about labeling right with this one.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we can merge the two and talk about them at the same time because when we're labeling things in absolutes. We're labeling them as good or bad. We're labeling them as nice or cruel, right? So, labeling is really helping us categorize the world, right? And when we're categorizing the world in absolutes, we're missing out on a lot of the beautiful aspects of it, right? All of the grays, all of the why we are all beautiful and ugly, right? Why we are all good and bad, they're all missed out by absolutes. So you're missing out on a lot of the like depth and quality of the world around you. And you're also coming across as to other people as though you're not hearing their perspectives, right? Because you are saying this is an absolute. Guess what? You don't like absolutes being challenged. Nobody normally likes absolutes being challenged. So it automatically primes you for conflicts within your relationships.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like it's such a useful survival strategy at one point in our life, right? Like we need to be able to point out and label everything we know. This is this and this is that, so we can accurately and easily go through the world. But now
Right.
things are deeply complicated. It's not possible to do that in any meaningful way anymore without a lot of conflict. I think it also, what do you say? It also it ties into like how we see ourselves with identity and worldview, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
we can oftentimes be insecure in knowing who we are and knowing what other people are, and then so we if we are labeled or labeled something, oftentimes people get very upset, people get very hurt, right?
Mm-hmm.
I like if somebody said my idea was dumb, so that means I'm dumb because
Mm-hmm.
I have to label having a dumb idea equals being dumb,
Mm-hmm.
even if that's not true. Nobody said you were dumb at all, right? But we connect. It's like we connect black and white thinking and labeling. It's so much easier to just say one action equals the whole, and then you lose out on any identification in the way.
Our society encourages labeling in so many different ways. We all know stereotypes are wrong. Stereotypes are a form of labeling, right? So when I say, if you are an attractive girl wearing a mini dress, you have to be a slut, that's labeling. We do that all the time around us. It is never helpful. And it's often not true. So, the important thing to know about labels is when we label ourselves, we label others, we are really putting them in these absolute boxes that really discredits their kind of like whole holistic self, right?
Yeah. I I think the biggest example for me of labeling that I deal with regularly is racism because
Hmm.
I'm black, so I'm around a lot of white people, and a lot of white people have this belief that to be racist is to be evil. When of course, to me, evil does not exist truly, right? Evil is this high concept we have. But then, so a lot of people, they have this idea that, because we want to believe that we're good. And especially if we're insecure about it, we really want to believe that we're good. We try to be good. Um, but then we have this belief like, if you do something racist, you are racist. Um, which, I mean, to me, labeling someone as anything just means I predict that they'll do the things. If I label someone as good, it just means I predict that they will do good actions in the future, right? That's the only useful way for me to identify things in that way. But anyway, so if they believe if you do something racist, you are racist, and racist people are bad. And so if I'm good, I cannot do anything racist, or else I will be bad. And then because they're insecure in who they are, they want to be good, but they can't label themselves as good, and they're afraid to. And then they will immediately label themselves as bad or anything else. And so if you bring that up to them, they will immediately lash out at you because they're so deeply uncomfortable with any insecurity and self identity.
I also think that racism is a part of our like culture and our community, right? So it becomes a lot more complicated, whereas there's a lot of systemic racism that is happening, and people don't understand that they are a part of it just by having the privileges that they have and not recognizing those, right? And I think recognizing the privileges that you have and understanding that other human beings, regardless of their skin color, their culture, their race, any of these things, their gender identity, their sexuality, they should be able to have the same human rights as us. And the fact that we have a privilege should be identified. And I think if we identified more of our privileges on a regular basis, there wouldn't be this inequality in um in our dialogue between each other, right? Like I recognize as a white woman that there's a lot of privileges that I have that Ryanne, you do not have. And that's the reality of this situation. I also think that there are certain privileges that you have that I do not have, right?
Definitely.
And I think looking at those things and seeing those on an individual level and seeing like what are the things that you experience and that I experience is the only way to truly understand each other, right? We have both experienced sexism and we can understand that. I have not experienced racism and I need to open the floor for you to be able to explain that to me so that way I can understand and I can be more reflective in my behaviors because I find a lot of people are doing racist things they didn't realize were racist until somebody explains it to them and then they feel really insecure and vulnerable and they can't accept that feedback. The reality is other people get to decide if you're being racist to them or not. And I think by us like just labeling someone that way and not actually talking about how it came across and how to improve in the future is a way of not actually dealing with the core issue. It's just kind of stigmatizing and labeling someone as bad. What I want is to educate that person so they understand what they did that was racist and how they could behave and what the expectation in my thought should be for everybody to avoid those kinds of interactions. But I have made racist comments to people in the past and not even realized it until the person said something to me, right? I made a comment to a young child once about their hair and they told me that that was racist. I was like, "Oh, I love your hair. I love how fluffy and like puffy it is." And they were like, I don't like that. And I was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." But I didn't know until they told me and now I know moving forward, right? So racism, we talk about like micro racism and then we talk about systemic racism and we can't put both of them in the same absolute category because some people are just blatantly horrible people and are racist, right? But not everybody that makes a racist comment is automatically, a KKK member. Sometimes they're ignorant, right? And ignorance and stupidity is different. But sometimes people make ignorant comments. And I think you and I have probably both done that in our life. Where we evolve is when we recognize, accept, improve, right? And that's what this show is all about, is accepting ourselves, understanding ourselves, and then figuring out how to improve ourselves and how to tolerate, right? And sometimes
Hmm.
we make mistakes. Having that feedback and those negative feelings is important for us to be able to grow as humans. Negative feelings aren't always bad. Sometimes negative feelings are appropriate and make sense for the situation. Do not take away your ability to grow from that emotional experience. Allow that experience to happen so you can grow. If you avoid it, you will continue to run into that problem. And that's why I think racism is the way it is.
That was a very well said essay.
I'm
I
sorry. I fell on a, yeah, I get down rabbit holes, you guys. I'm sorry, but like Ryan, we feel really strongly about this. And I think what
Yeah,
makes it so powerful is that we come across from different ways to unite on this subject,
yeah.
right? And I think it's a big part of mental wellness in America.
Yeah, accepting ourselves where we are, not trying to label ourselves is most important. For the labeling audience, I would say most important thing is if you or someone else does an action, don't immediately label them as that action, because people are complex and it gets completely useless at times, and then it will make you more insecure. And also, nobody likes being labeled. That's just you can test that out. Nobody will like it. I but anyway, we don't have much time left. I guess we should try to go
Go to
through the last
shooting and
few.
musting. Yeah, we
Shooting
should
and
go to
Mustang.
shooting. Yeah. So shooting and musting is when we are focusing on mistakes and judgments of ourselves or others, right? We are kind of Monday morning quarterbacking ourselves, and we are saying like, "Oh, in this fight last night, I should have said this to this person. Or I could have done this differently. Or I must do this so that way, X, Y, and Z happens." When we are putting this level of intensity on ourselves and we're focusing on what we're doing wrong and not how to improve in the future, right? We're never actually going to make any growth because we never have time machines. You can never go back in the future. You can never change what you should have said to that person, right? So all of those thoughts are not helpful. What would be helpful is to think about how you can repair with that person, how you could kind of avoid that happening again with that person. So shooting and musting is really about kind of paralyzing yourself in the past mistakes or the current mistakes or the anticipated future mistakes and not actually allowing space and time to be.
Right. It really we really let it define us sometimes. I mean, I've dealt with a lot. Um, is the idea of like you have to give up your guilt and your pain because oftentimes we let ourselves be controlled by our guilt and pain and think about all these things we should have done differently. Um, a lot of it also is like I feel guilty or I feel pain or I did this awkward thing, right? I did these bad things, and then I this suffering I'm having as a result of it, it feels very meaningless, right? I hate it, and at the same time my brain is, because your brain is having you go through these tapes, right? These scenes in your head over and over to train yourself. Next time we will be ready. Next time we will not make that mistake because we are training you over and over for it, so you have to be ready. But truly, I mean, the suffering you're having over this is very meaningless, right? Because nothing is happening right now, and yet it's this constant pain or guilt or whatever. Um, but then what's really difficult is knowing, well, this pain is really meaningless, right? But then saying, okay, I'm going to give that up. Because then oftentimes we want to keep thinking about it and keep dealing with it. So then the pain is never meaningless because we keep experiencing it. Eventually they have some meaning to it. But really we just have to accept I can't go back in the past. I have to accept that I made the mistakes I did, and then I have to be able to move on. I can't define myself by my past. I can't label myself as this person paralyzed by some mistakes or some past actions.
Yeah, I think it comes to that quote, and this is a self-compassion quote, obviously, but like all past versions of yourself brought you to where you are right now today, right? And you need to accept and be compassionate to yourself about that.
Yeah. Which episode of Self Compassion?
It's coming up. I think it's next, episode 2.
That's next.
Yeah, it's
Everyone
really
be ready for
important.
that one.
Mm-hmm.
Watch out for that one. Then what next up? We have overgeneralizations.
Overgeneralizing. So this is when you're expecting to repeat past experiences in all future similar experiences. It is very similar to jumping to conclusions. Um, the difference is it can go into stereotypes and labels also. So overgeneralizing can be this all situation things, whereas jumping to conclusions is normally about future telling. Overgeneralization is past, future, and present, right?
I say.
Yeah. Um, The next one that I think might make sense, because people normally understand overgeneralization, that is a very highly used word right now. I think
Yeah.
overgeneralization, same thing with like trigger, like you triggered me. We should talk about that more too in future episodes. But a lot of people have a pretty strong understanding of overgeneralizing. Really, what I want you to ask yourself again, like those other situations of mental filtering, am I seeing it all? With overgeneralizing, it's am I assuming things that might not be true, right?
Yeah.
Emotional reasoning is so important for us to talk about, and I think it's the most important one for us to be aware of. And I'm
Yeah.
gonna make a lot of people's minds blown in with this statement, and I'm really sorry, but this is true. And let's get to it right away.
All right.
Your your feelings, right, are just chemical responses in your body. Your thoughts aren't real. Ooh, your thoughts are just what you have decided to explain what's happening in the world around you, right? So when you take your physiological response to emotions and combine it with your cognitive response to emotions, you can fall into the system of, well, if I feel that way, it must be true.
Right. Yeah. And it sucks because it ties into everything else we've talked about. Like I'm afraid to be wrong. I'm afraid to make people upset. And so I feel this fear, so it must be true. I'm insecure. I have this fear of who I am, so it must be true. When you can act not on those beliefs that are ingrained to us through trauma or whatever, right? Like I believe that I have to be a people pleaser. I have to make sure no conflict occurs because then people won't get mad. But then you can also think about it like rationally in terms of just logically. I know I do not need to be this way. And I think a very important thing is we don't act according to our beliefs and feelings, but rather acting according to what we want from a logical perspective in order to improve in ourselves.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are feeling like they are captive to what their body is showing them with emotional reasoning, right? They're saying, well, like, I didn't want to feel that way, but that's how I felt. So that's concrete, that's absolute. Right? Do you see how they're again
Right.
pulling into each other? So, because it's an absolute feeling and I'm feeling sad, then I'm labeling myself as being, you know, so depressed by this situation that I couldn't possibly go to that party. Do you see how they start ending up intertwining with each other? Emotional reasoning is so often the trigger to all of these other cognitive distortions because first you have to believe that the emotion is the guide and then the thoughts and behaviors follow, right? That's the
Right.
danger of emotional reasoning. Your emotions are not your guide. Your emotions are responses to what's happening in the world around you. Your emotions are giving you thoughts in response to this physiological. So your brain sends your emotions through your body physiologically. Then it processes your emotions cognitively. And then together, those two emotions give you behavioral urges, right? This is the foundation of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? If you start off with emotional reasoning and you don't understand that point, everything else is going to be skewed from there, right? So the importance of
Right.
understanding that your emotions are not facts, that your emotions are not going to guide you in the way that you truly need to guide yourself is the beginning of what I consider like emotional evolution.
Hmm. And we're going to be covering the cognitive behavioral therapy model more on a future episode.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's we need to not allow our emotions to control us. Our emotions, they're okay to have, and they're okay to look at them and let them sit there. They don't need to be defining us because emotions are all temporary.
Right.
Um, and then there's the final one, magnification, minimization.
Now, this one goes very closely with personalization oftentimes because what happens is people will magnify their personal responsibility for an experience and minimize other people's, right? Um, People can also project blame onto other people that is not equal to the level of responsibility with magnification. So I can be like, well, we only got into a fight because of Bob. It's Bob's fault. He has 100% responsibility, right? Or I could say Bob has no responsibility and I could minimize it and personalize it to myself and say, actually, I have all the responsibility. But a lot of times, this whole idea of fairness and this whole idea of kind of giving out responsibility to people, not really ever productive. It's not really about who has what percentage of the pie. what the focus should be about, the healthy focus should be about how to resolve and avoid a repetition of that problem.
Right.
Magnification and minimization are actually kind of like filibusters that just make you stuck in the problem and thinking about the emotions and thoughts around it and never actually progressing past that problem.
Why do we magnify?
Why do we have any of these cognitive distortions, right? We have them because we fall into these unhelpful thinking styles, and sometimes they're conditioned, as in we are taught by people around us as small children to behave in this way, or it's through observational learning, whereas I grew up seeing someone respond this way. So if I grew
Yeah.
up with you, Ryan, and you were always magnifying problems, guess what? That's probably how I'm going to see and understand the world because I use observational learning as a child. A lot of kids do, right? So we
Yeah.
accidentally stumble across things on our own, but we are also accidentally taught by the people around us to engage in some of these behaviors, not because they maliciously want us to, but because they are engaging in them themselves.
Yeah, I see. That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, it's survival strategies that aren't applicable to today's world always end up being very problematic. I yeah, yeah, I think a lot of people like magnifying is this useful tool, especially in arguments and conflicts, if you're worried that like blame will have some negative consequence. Some people like think of ways so they can a conflict talking about emotions then becomes an argument where you have to prove your side to win, right, to avoid blame. When I feel like a lot of times conflict occurs from expectations not being met for whatever reason. And then simply talking about why those expectations weren't met and how to prevent them in the future is the most best thing you can do in your relationships.
There are so many distortions that happen within what you just described, right? It's important to a lot of people that I label who the problem was, right? It's important to a lot of people that they can create this absolute so that way you were wrong and I'm okay as a person, right? There's a lot of things that people do and these are all about preserving themselves. The self-preservation is this archetype, which means that it's actually ingrained in all of us to want to do, right? And whether
Yeah.
I am putting myself in this comfortable, not really comfortable, but putting myself in one of these distortions because I'm scared that someone's going to abandon me, or I'm putting myself in this situation because I have trauma and I'm hypervigilant and I can't accept responsibility. There are so many different reasons we fall into these distortions. What's important to recognize is that none of them are healthy and none of them lead to healthy behaviors, thoughts, or emotions.
Yeah. Now that we've gone through all of the distortions, should we give the audience like any homework or any final thoughts?
I
So
love
we
it.
can actually
Um,
apply these things to our
yes.
regular life because we can give people tools, but like, how is you, the audience, going to apply this to your life today?
Yeah. So there are some questions I want you to think about. If you find yourself really annoyed, you're finding that you're having strong emotions, you find that you're having a sense that things aren't fair, that there's been injustice, you have an urge to hide away, or you have an urge to escape. Those are the times that you want to pause and you want to ask yourself, am I seeing the whole situation? Are there shades of gray that I'm not looking into? Am I using absolutes? Right? Am I labeling situations? Am I predicting things that may never come? Am I responding from anxiety? These are some of the questions that we ask ourselves to be able to identify, hold on, I'm going down this rabbit hole and it's not going to be good for me or the people around me. That's the
Yeah.
first step is recognition that you're having it. The second is, I would say to be kind to yourself, to think about what you really need in this situation. This is not something that people naturally do. People do not naturally pause and say, what do I need to be kind to myself through this difficult situation? People are often thinking about, how do I survive the situation, which falls back onto that, who's to blame for it? Who can I blame my pain on? It's not about blaming pain on anybody. It's not about who was right or wrong in conflict. It's about how you're going to treat yourself during that conflict and how you're going to support yourself to get out of the conflict in a healthy, balanced way that really matters. There's lots of times that we don't engage in details of conflict with other people because they're not able to engage in that with us. But that doesn't mean we do not process within ourselves because that is the step towards wellness.
Yeah. I My question for the audience, I want you guys, I think it might be prudent for you guys to ask yourselves, is if you're in a situation where you're afraid to do something or you feel compelled to do something, ask yourself why. And if you're afraid, ask yourself, why am I afraid? And then truly think about it, because you can often say, well, I'm afraid of being wrong. But that's not actually why. You're afraid of the consequences of being wrong. You're afraid of the consequences of some thought. And usually it will come back to, I will feel bad. I will feel negative emotion, right? And if you get to the point, sit with yourself and think, will actually the world end or will I die or whatever if I feel this negative emotion? And don't let that control you. So anytime you're afraid to do something, think, why am I afraid to do this? Why do I feel anxiety about this? And ask yourself multiple times. It usually takes like 3 whys to actually get to why. 5. Yeah, in my industrial engineering class, it was the 5 whys of like processing. So it takes 5 whys to get to the final. So do think about that. Ask yourself why 5 times.
And it's funny that you say that because the fifth why is supposed to connect us to the core belief that is the true kind of trigger and pain associated with your situation, right? So if you can get yourself to that fifth why, you should be able to have a lot more internal insight into why you are so bothered by what's happening right now.
Yeah.
Full disclosure, I am a therapist. I am not your therapist though. So if there are people that are really experiencing distress or people that just are questioning their mental health and questioning having mental illness and are experiencing pain, please be kind to yourself. Go and see a professional. This is all about giving an an introductory to mental wellness. And it does not replace counseling. So if you feel as though you need more, give yourself more, please.
Yeah. I And I don't know if we're posting this on YouTube or whatever. In the comments, tell us if this was helpful. Let us know feedback. We always love feedback. And also, if these questions were good, did you have any new realizations or thoughts?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Please think this is the podcast for you to improve your life. I and that's it. This is our pilot episode. We're excited to keep on doing this. I thank you everybody for listening. This was Ryan Wilson.
Melissa Recor.
Sparkle on.